The summons came in on two separate channels at 3:14 hours, which was the first thing that struck me as wrong. In 31 years working framework arbitration, I had never received a simultaneous dual priority contact from two fleets approaching the same vector. The second thing that struck me was the identifier code embedded in both transmissions. Varath Dominion Origin, Category 5 Sovereign Succession Advisory. The third thing, and this one I will carry the rest of my life, was that I already knew exactly what I needed to do about it. I was 58 years old and had been the senior protocol arbiter for the Earth Sovereignty Framework Sarath office for 11 years. My predecessor had been a woman named Sale Dorith who had held the post for 22 years before me, and her predecessor before her, a man named Tarith Vaughn who had held it for 19. We were not a glamorous office. We sat 3,000 meters above the Anatolian megacity, on a platform that most Earth residents had never heard of, and we spent our days cross-referencing treaty language and filing certification amendments with civilizations that most of our own species had never encountered. The pay was adequate. The view, if you liked vast gray sky and the distant gleam of the ring overhead, was remarkable. I put on a fresh uniform, poured cold water on my face, and walked to the treaty chamber. My deputy, a younger man named Corvin Thale, met me in the corridor with a data slate and the expression he wore when something had exceeded his training. He was 29 and very capable, and in 3 years of working together I had only seen that particular expression twice before. Once when the Kethara continuance had arrived to challenge our orbital lane classifications, and once when a Silvari survey vessel had queried our filing date on a boundary covenant that predated their registry by 11,000 years. Both times, we had been fine. I had not yet told him why. 2 fleets, he said, matching my pace. 17 vessels each, decelerating into the outer approach corridor on parallel trajectories. They lit up each other's screens about 40 minutes ago, and neither one has communicated with the other. Both have opened direct channels to us. I know. The identifier codes say Varath Dominion. I know that too. He was quiet for 3 steps. The Varath haven't had contact with Earth in 90,000 years, I said. Give or take. They classified us as client tributary node 9441V before the third ice advance and left a dormant maintenance beacon at the outer marker. The beacon stopped transmitting about 46,000 years ago. They would have interpreted the silence as confirmation of dormancy. I pushed open the door to the outer reception suite. Pull up the filing index, the Varath Succession Authority folder. Year 28 of the framework's 3rd administrative cycle. He stopped walking. Sir. That's the one, I said. Bring it to the chamber. The Sarath reception platform had been built 500 years ago to handle exactly this kind of event, though the architects had not been thinking of the Varath specifically. It was a formal space, not a military one. The inner treaty chamber held a long table of polished dark stone quarried from the Tibetan plateau, 12 chairs on each side, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out at a sky now brightening at its eastern edge with the earliest suggestion of dawn. The ring crossed overhead in a slow arc, its mass and its lights visible even through scattered high cloud. From this height you could also see, if the air was clear enough, the formation lines of the patrol elements, 4 continuity-class heavy defense vessels holding station at 200 kilometers altitude, their profiles gray and enormous against the gradient of the sky. Most mornings I barely registered them. This morning I looked. Corvin came in with the folder. He set it on the table with the careful movements of a man who understood he was handling something old. I didn't open it yet. Instead, I sat and let myself think through what the next several hours would look like, checking the sequence the way I had been trained to check it. Not because I was uncertain, the work had been done long before I was born, but because the doing of it needed to be clean. There is a kind of weight that comes with carrying something that has waited 30,000 years to be used. You want to be worthy of the people who built it. Let me tell you about the Verath. 90,000 years ago, they were one of perhaps a dozen spacefaring civilizations within what we would later call the Inner Spiral Reach. Their dominion was not the largest power in that region, and not the most technically advanced, but they were politically sophisticated in ways that most of their neighbors were not. They had developed a comprehensive system of client world classification, a formal taxonomy of dependent civilizations that owed various categories of tribute, service, and allegiance to the Dominion based on their developmental status at time of registration. Earth, apparently, had been observed and classified during a brief survey operation that our own records could not date more precisely than a 40,000-year window. We had been assigned to Category 6, Dormant Biosphere, Pre-Sapient Notation, Reclassification pending First Sapience Emergence. The intent, we eventually understood, was that a Verath vessel would return periodically to check our developmental progress and formally adjust our category as we grew. This was not malicious. It was, in their framework, a form of stewardship. The Verath had not returned. We knew from recovered beacon data, and from the partial records of the continuity, exchanges that the Dominion had experienced a succession crisis of its own approximately 60,000 years ago. Not a collapse, the Verath were too methodical for that, but a long contraction, a withdrawal to core systems, a pulling in of administrative reach. 97 of their 212 registered client worlds had dropped off the active maintenance schedule. Earth was one of them. The beacon had kept transmitting its dormancy confirmation for a further 14,000 years and then gone dark. No one had come. We had been found in those records 4 decades ago by an archivist named Pethcavel, junior researcher in the Framework's Historical Treaty Division. She had been cataloging dormant designation files, a task so routine that it was assigned to entry-level staff, when she had pulled the Verath tributary charter from the deep archive and read, with some care, the full succession provisions attached to it. Most tributary charters had simple succession clauses. If the Dominion changes governing structure, the client relationship transfers to the successor administration. Standard language. The Verath charter was not standard. The Verath had anticipated, with what I can only describe as extraordinary bureaucratic foresight, the specific problem of disputed succession. Their succession authority, the body empowered to certify legitimate claims to Dominion governance, had been structured with a provision for external observer certifiers. These were not member civilizations. They were independent parties whose long institutional continuity and demonstrated treaty adherence qualified them to register as certification witnesses. Civilizations whose formal acknowledgement of a succession claim would carry legal weight within the authority's framework. The provision was narrow. It required that the observer certifier's registration predate the succession dispute by no less than 1 full administrative cycle, approximately 10,000 years, and that the registering civilization maintain unbroken institutional continuity from the filing date forward. Pethcavel had read this provision twice. Then she had written a 4-page memo to her section head. The memo had worked its way up through the framework's administrative structure over the following 18 months, collecting endorsements and counterarguments and careful legal analysis at each level. By the time it reached the director's office, it was accompanied by a 60-page technical brief, a formal assessment from 3 independent treaty scholars, and a recommendation, unanimous, that Earth file. The filing had taken 11 years to prepare. The documentation ran to 407 pages. It included Earth's unbroken institutional record from the founding of the framework, the complete cross-reference succession authority provisions with annotations in original Verath administrative register, and a certification of continuity extending backward through our institutional history to a date that predated the Dominion's own succession dispute by 20,000 years. Earth had filed as a founding observer certifier of the Varath Succession Authority 30,412 years ago. The authority had acknowledged the filing. The acknowledgement had been a single line of administrative notation in their registry, which was all the form required. There had been no response, no query, no objection. There had been nothing for 30,000 years because nothing had needed to happen. The registration simply existed, patient as a geological formation, waiting for the moment a Varath succession dispute became relevant to Earth. That moment was this morning. I opened the folder. The first page was the acknowledgement notation, a single line of administrative text in Varath standard registry script, translated and certified by the Framework's language division 40 years ago. It was unremarkable to look at. A registry entry, a date stamp, an assigned filing number. Nothing in its appearance explained what it meant, any more than a seed looks like a forest. I had read it so many times that I could have recited it from memory, but I read it again anyway, because I believe you owe that kind of attention to the things that were built for you by people who will never see the result. The documentation that followed it ran to 407 pages. I had read it completely twice, once when I first took the Arbiter post as part of my orientation, and once 6 months ago when the Succession Advisory Monitor had flagged an increase in Varath interfleet communications in the outer registry channels. The second reading had taken 12 days. I had made notes in the margins and discussed them with Corvin, who had been 3 years into the post by then and was sharp enough to understand what he was reading, though the full significance of the filing had not yet been clear to either of us. We had known something was coming. We had not known the shape of it. Behind the acknowledgement notation came the full cross-referenced succession authority provisions. 123 pages of original Varath administrative register text, annotated in the margins by the team of treaty scholars who had done the preparatory work, with translations, linguistic analysis, and formal notes on the sections whose meaning had required extended scholarly debate to resolve. One scholar, a woman named Davith Oriel, who had worked on the project for its entire 11 years and whose notes appeared more frequently than anyone else's, had written in the margin beside Provision 7a, "This is the hinge. Everything else is scaffolding." She had not been wrong. The filing itself, the formal registration instrument, began on page 131. It was precise, dry, and extraordinary. Earth's institutional record, traced and certified back 40,000 years. The Framework's continuity chain, verified through 17 administrative transitions. The technical argument for qualifying under the Observer Certifier provision, built from the Varath's own charter language, turned against the limitation they had presumably never expected an external party to read closely enough to invoke. I thought, not for the first time, about the people who had built it, the archivists and the legal scholars and the diplomatic technicians, most of whom had known they would not see the morning it was used. They had done the work anyway. They had done it carefully, without spectacle, over 11 years, and then set it aside for the civilization that would come after them to carry. The first Varath vessel to enter the outer approach corridor did so at 5:12 hours. By then the dawn had come in properly, and the platform's eastern windows showed a sky gone pale gold over the Anatolian megacity. The city stretched below us in all directions, 12 million people, towers that rose 600 meters at their tallest, transit arteries still quiet at this hour, the Sovereignty District's administrative spires catching the early light. The ring was clearly visible now, its arc sweeping from northeast to southwest, the construction lights of its maintenance drones blinking in slow sequence. At this altitude you could see the ring's true scale for what it was. Not a thin orbital feature, but a structure with observable depth and width, a completed project that had taken 11,000 years to build and that now housed, among other things, one of our largest defense coordination stations. The first delegation identified itself as the formal retinue of Sareth Vel, first daughter of the current Dominion administration and primary heir under the Dominion Succession Convention. Their transmission was formal to the point of ceremony. Complete title recitation, full lineage notation, the succession priority code that entitled a primary heir to demand reception at any client world within Dominion registry. They requested immediate transit clearance and reception honors appropriate to a category, one sovereign visit. They were, I noted, very confident. The second delegation arrived at the approach corridor 11 minutes later. They identified themselves as the retinue of Kale Vel, second daughter, carrying a counterclaim instrument that challenged the succession priority designation on procedural grounds and asserted equal standing for reception under a parallel provision of the Dominion Charter. Their tone was a degree more combative, a degree more aware that the presence of the first delegation had already complicated their position. But they were also confident, both of them were. I watched the approach display in the adjacent monitoring room for a few minutes. Corvin was there with our communications technician, a steady woman named Yara Synth, who had worked the overnight shift and had the alert but unruffled quality of someone who had decided some time ago that the universe would show her remarkable things, and the correct response was to take good notes. "Sensor picture from the outer platform," I asked. Yara pulled it up. The two formations were arrayed at approximately 120,000 kilometers, holding their separation distance. Both had cut thrust now and were in passive station keeping. 17 vessels each, as Corvin had said, comparable in class distribution, a mix of what appeared to be administrative transports, escort frigates, and a single larger vessel in each formation that carried the sovereign's retinue directly. At this range, the patrol formation would be clearly visible to both delegations. 4 continuity-class vessels plus the full complement of the Sarath Station's own defensive array. Neither delegation had commented on this. Neither had asked about the ring. I thought about that. What you do not ask about is often more revealing than what you do. There was, I later learned from the formal approach log, a 13-minute period during which both fleets simply held position after reaching passive station keeping. No communication outward, no communication between the formations, no inquiry to the platform. 13 minutes is not a long time in most contexts. In the context of two delegations that had each arrived expecting to complete a formality and depart within hours, 13 minutes of silence from professional diplomatic corps was a significant pause. I have thought about those 13 minutes a great deal in the years since. Both formations could see the ring clearly from 120,000 kilometers. The ring is not subtle at that range. It is 240,000 kilometers in circumference, and the station at its eastern arc carries running lights visible at twice that distance. They could also see the patrol elements. The continuity-class heavy defense vessels are 1,400 meters from bow to stern, and carry surface profile designators that any competent military survey instrument can identify from 200,000 kilometers. 4 of them on standard patrol, in formation, around a world that had been classified dormant pre-sapient in the Verath registry. Neither daughter asked about any of it, not in those 13 minutes and not in the formal approach transmission that followed. They asked about docking protocols and reception honors, and the jurisdiction of the arbitration proceeding. They did not ask what the ring was or how long it had been there or how many vessels the patrol rotation maintained. What you do not ask about, you have already decided how to handle. Standard framework diplomatic register. I want to speak to both simultaneously. Yara looked at me. Joint, they haven't communicated with each other since. I know, I straightened my collar. Joint channel, please. The transmission light came on. This is Senior Protocol Arbiter Davin Orath, Earth Sovereignty Framework, Sarath Reception Platform. I am addressing this transmission simultaneously to the retinue of Sareth Vel, First Daughter, and the retinue of Kale Vel, second daughter, in full hearing of both parties. This is standard framework procedure for concurrent reception requests. I want to confirm receipt of both priority advisories and advise both parties that reception transit clearance will be issued jointly, with arrival scheduled at 8:30 hours, Sarath local time. Platform docking for both delegations will be at designated bays, Sarath Vel retinue to Bay 1, Kale Vel retinue to Bay 2. Appropriate reception will be provided to both parties under Framework Sovereign Visit Protocol, Category 1. I paused, choosing the next words with the care they deserved. I also want to advise both parties, as required by Succession Authority Notification Provision 7A, that Earth holds a relevant filing in the Varath Succession Authority Registry, which will be material to the proceedings this morning. Documentation will be available for review at the Treaty Chamber table. Framework arbitration begins at 900 hours. I ended the transmission. Yara was looking at me with an expression that had moved somewhat beyond her usual unruffled quality. Provision 7A, she said carefully, I've never heard that cited. It requires that an observer certifier notify both claimants of their registered status prior to any formal succession proceeding in which they may be called upon to act. I picked up the folder. I've been waiting to cite it for 11 years. I want to make sure I get the wording right. There was a long silence in the monitoring room. What does being an observer certifier mean exactly? Corvin asked, which was a fair question for a man who had been given 40 minutes' notice. It means, I said, that neither of them can have their succession claim certified without us. I left them with that and went to review the documentation one more time. I had been reviewing it in one form or another for 11 years. There is a practice in this kind of work, and it is a practice, not merely a habit, because it requires deliberate attention to sustain it, of returning regularly to the original documents, not to verify facts you already know, to remind yourself what they mean. The 407-page filing was not simply a legal instrument. It was a record of human beings spending 11 years doing exacting, unglamorous work on behalf of a civilization that would not exist in recognizable form when the work was finally used. Every annotation in the margins, every internal debate resolved by scholarly consensus, every translation verified against the original register text, these were choices made by people who would not be present for the outcome. They made them anyway. They made them carefully. That quality of care, sustained over 11 years by people who knew they would not see the end of it, is what the filing actually was. The 407 pages were its body. That was its soul. I sat with that for a few minutes. Then I closed the folder and went back to the monitoring room to check on the approach. The Varath are tall, between 2 and 3 meters depending on caste and age, with 4 primary limbs and 2 vestigial upper limbs that in more primitive evolutionary stages were presumably a second pair of arms, and are now used primarily for fine manipulation and status display. Their skin is a dark composite material, close in texture to heavy leather, that shifts color and undertone with body temperature and emotional state. Along the dorsal ridge, from the back of the skull to approximately mid-torso, runs a line of bioluminescent tissue, what their scholars call the authority display, that brightens and dims in patterns carrying social and emotional information. Among the Varath, words confirm what the light has already said. Speaking without the light fully engaged is considered a form of deception, or at the very least a sign of emotional disorder. I had read extensively about Varath social biology in the months after I took the arbiter post, for exactly this reason. When they arrived, I would be able to read them at least partially. They would not be able to read me at all. This is not a tactical observation. It is simply a difference worth accounting for, the way you account for the ceiling height before you bring a very tall guest into a room. The delegations arrived within 4 minutes of each other at 8:34. Sarath Vel came first, which was consistent with the priority claim she had filed. She was taller than I expected, perhaps 2.5 meters, and moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had spent her adult life in rooms where every movement was observed and evaluated. Her escort was 8 individuals, 4 security cast in formal armor, 2 administrative aides, and 2 who carried the delegation's documentation cases with the precise, neutral expressions of people who understood that their primary function was to be invisible. Her dorsal display was lit at a steady amber, calm authority, which I recognized as the formal diplomatic register from my reading. Vell arrived 4 minutes later through Bay 2 and waited in the outer reception hall, while her elder sister's retinue was formally logged and directed to their anteroom. This was correct procedure, and she submitted to it without visible protest, which told me something about her. Her display, when I passed her in the corridor, was amber, also slightly deeper, a note of something I read as careful patience. She was 2 centimeters shorter than her sister and moved with a quality that I would describe inadequately as coiled, not hostile, contained. I greeted both delegations in their antechambers with the same words, the same brief courtesy, and the same measured explanation. Framework arbitration would begin at 900. Both parties would be received at the table together. All documentation relevant to the morning's proceedings had been prepared. I answered no questions. I was not being evasive. In framework procedure, the table is the place for questions, and beginning the exchange of information before the formal session opens tends to create informal understandings that complicate what should happen formally. I had seen it go wrong too many times to risk it this morning. At 8:55, I went to the treaty chamber, set the documentation folder at the head of the table, and stood at the window for a few minutes. The Anatolian megacity was fully awake now, the transit arteries moving with morning traffic, the towers catching the 9 o'clock sun on their upper levels. Somewhere below those towers, in offices and workshops and maintenance bays and schools and transit stations, 12 million people were living their ordinary morning, entirely unaware that their world was being visited today by the delegations of 2 imperial heirs who had come to extract a declaration of allegiance from a client world they had never expected to find alive. I thought about Pethcavel. I thought about the 11 years of preparation that had preceded the filing and the 30,000 years it had waited. I thought about the people whose names appeared in the documentation chain, every archivist and treaty scholar and legal analyst who had contributed to the 407 pages, most of them long dead, none of them present to see the morning it was finally used. There is a particular kind of loneliness in representing a preparation that outlived everyone who made it. I had known it for 11 years. I was ready for it. Both delegations entered the treaty chamber at 900 exactly. The placement of heirs from a disputed succession at a shared table is an exercise in spatial diplomacy that could fill a manual of its own, and I will spare you the details. What matters is that it was done correctly. Sareth Vell at my right, Cale Vell at my left, their respective aides arranged behind them, no hierarchy implied by the seating that had not already been established by their own charter's precedence provisions. The documentation cases were open on both sides. The long dark table caught the morning light across its surface. For a moment before anyone spoke, I was aware of the scale of what was in the room. 2 heirs of a civilization 90,000 years old, a framework arbiter whose civilization those heirs had classified as a dormant pre-sapient biosphere, the folder between us. Sareth Vell spoke first, as the primary claimant. Her voice was a resonant mid-register with the careful enunciation of a formal speaker, and her administrative aide translated the Verath succession proceeding opener into framework diplomatic register in real time through a device set at her elbow. The words were expected. She was here to receive Earth's formal declaration of allegiance under Tributary Charter 9441V in support of the lawful succession of the primary heir. The charter was ancient but valid. The client relationship was dormant but unbroken. Earth's declaration would be a formality, given the absence of any contrary evidence. Vell followed with the counterclaim in the same formal register. Earth should consider its declaration carefully, as the succession priority code her sister cited was subject to procedural challenge under Article 14 of the Dominion Charter, and the secondary heir's claim had equal validity under the parallel provision she had named in her initial transmission. She did not expect Earth to resist either claim. She expected Earth to make the correct choice. Both dorsal displays were amber throughout. Both presentations were measured, professional, and entirely certain that this morning's work would be brief. I waited until both had finished. Then I said, "Thank you. I have a procedural item to address before we proceed to declarations." I opened the folder. In the year corresponding to 30,412 years before this date, the Earth Sovereignty Framework filed a registration instrument with the Verath Succession Authority under the Observer Certifier provision of the authority's founding charter. The registration was accepted and acknowledged by the authority registry. Earth's institutional continuity from that filing date to the present has been unbroken. I laid the first document on the table, the acknowledgement notation, translated and certified. This filing was prepared over 11 years by a team of framework treaty scholars and was submitted through the authority's standard administrative channel. It has been in the registry for 30,000 years. I let that number sit in the air for a moment. Under Succession Authority Provision 7A, I continued, an observer certifier registered prior to a succession dispute is a required participant in any formal succession proceeding. Their certification of a claimant's legitimacy is not advisory. It is structurally mandatory. A succession claim that has not been certified by all registered observer certifiers is not valid under the authority's own charter. I set down the second document, the provision itself, with the relevant passages annotated. The room was very quiet. Sareth Vell's dorsal display had changed. The steady amber had broken into something less regular, a rapid cycling between amber and a color I did not have a name for, in the records a dull gold, which the Verath literature described as cognitive recalibration under unexpected information. Her aide had stopped translating. He was reading the document I had placed on the table. Vell had not moved. Her display had gone to a deep, still gold that I recognized, after a moment, as the display equivalent of processing something at a depth that had not been reached in some time. "I want to confirm," Sareth Vell said, and her aide translated with a slight delay that told me he was also still processing, "that you are claiming certification authority over the succession claim of the Dominion's primary heir." "I am not claiming it," I said. "I hold it. The filing establishes it. The authority's own charter provisions it." I set a third document on the table, the complete founding charter of the succession authority, the observer certifier provision highlighted. Earth does not require you to believe this. The authority's own registry contains the record. If your vessels carry a full copy of the authority archives, which I believe Dominion Succession Protocol requires, your administrative aides can verify the registration directly. Sareth Vell looked at her aide. He looked back at her. Then he opened his documentation case and began working. Vell had still not moved. "Why," she said after a long pause, "did Earth file 30,000 years ago?" It was the right question. I had expected it from Sareth and was not surprised to receive it from Kale. "Because we found the provision," I said. "An archivist named Peth Cavell discovered it in the Tributary Charter records 4 decades ago. The Frameworks Treaty Division assessed it, prepared the filing, and submitted it through the proper channel. We filed because the provision existed, because we qualified under its terms, and because we understood that a filing registered 30,000 years before a dispute would be available to us when the dispute arrived. We did not know the specific nature of the dispute. We knew a dispute was statistically probable within the Dominion's succession framework within a span of time our institutional memory could accommodate. I let the clean simplicity of that settle in the room. Your civilization, Calvel said, prepared for a succession dispute in an empire you had never had contact with, in a form that would give you certification authority, and then waited 30,000 years for it to become relevant. Yes. Her display cycled through the deep gold and came to something slower, quieter, that I did not find in my reference materials. I had to interpret it from context. It looked to me like something adjacent to respect, not admiration exactly, not warmth, but the particular acknowledgement of a thing that had been built with more patience than you had assigned to the builder. Sareth Vel's aide looked up from his documentation case. He spoke 2 quiet words to her. She did not look at her sister. "The registration is valid," she said. "Yes," I agreed. The silence that followed was different from the silence at the beginning of the session. That silence had been the silence of 2 powerful people waiting for a formality to begin. This silence was the silence of 2 powerful people recalibrating every assumption they had made since they entered the outer approach corridor 3 hours ago. I let it go where it needed to go. Sareth Vel spoke first again, because she was the primary claimant and her discipline held even through this. "What does Earth's certification require?" "Nothing extraordinary," I said. "The succession authority's provisions specify that an observer certifier reviews the documentation of each claim and certifies, or declines to certify, its legitimacy under the Dominion's own charter and succession conventions. Earth does not determine who succeeds. We determine that the claim is procedurally valid within the authority's framework. A claimant who does not receive that certification cannot be recognized by the authority as legitimate." I folded my hands on the table. "Both of your claims may be certifiable. That assessment requires review. The review takes time. I want to be honest with you about that." "How much time?" Calvel asked. "The documentation you have brought will need to be reviewed against the authority charter provisions. We have copies of the full authority archive in our treaty library. We acquired them as part of the observer certifier registration process. Given the complexity of a dual succession claim, I would estimate several months of formal review, with preliminary findings within 30 days. Another silence. I watched their displays and tried to read what was happening in the exchange between them that was not passing through words. Sareth Vel said, carefully, "During the review period, both claims exist in a state of undeclared succession." "That's correct. Neither of us can act as the Dominion's governing authority until the certification is issued. Under the authority's own provisions, yes." Her display was doing something I had not seen it do before, a slow, deep amber pulse that I would later look up and find described in Verath behavioral literature as the display pattern of an individual who has encountered the limits of their preparation and is deciding how to meet them. It is, the literature noted, considered a dignified response. Its opposite, the brittle rapid cycling of displaced anger, is considered beneath the class of individual who holds authority. Sareth Vel was, I thought, a very good heir. "The Dominion has been operating in a state of contested succession for 14 years, she said. "Every month of delay has consequences for our core systems." "I understand," I said. "I want to move the review forward as quickly as the framework standards allow. I also want to note, and I say this as the arbiter, not as an adversary, that the review process was designed by your own authority to provide exactly this function. The instability of undeclared succession is precisely the problem the observer certifier provision was built to resolve. The certification, when it issues, will be stronger because it was issued by a body with no interest in either claim. That is its purpose," Calvel said quietly, "and if neither claim can be certified." Then the authorities' charter provides a resolution mechanism that I would not invoke without being absolutely certain it was warranted, I said. I don't anticipate that outcome. What I've seen of both claims suggests they are structurally sound. The dispute is procedural, not foundational. Procedural disputes are resolvable. I meant this. I was not offering comfort. I was stating my professional assessment. Kale Vell looked at her sister. It was the first time since they had sat down that they had looked at each other. I could not read what passed between them. The display language was moving too quickly for my vocabulary, but it lasted perhaps 4 seconds, and when they both looked back at me, there was something different in the room. Not warmth, not alliance, but an acknowledgement that they were both, for this moment, in the same position. "We'll need to transmit to the Dominion," Sareth Vell said. "Of course. The platform has secure diplomatic channels. My communications technician will set up dedicated lines for both delegations. I'd ask that you keep the transmission contents confidential until preliminary findings are issued, as a condition of the review process. Beyond that restriction, your communications are your own." "And Earth's position," Kale Vell said, "on the substance of the succession. You said the certification is not advisory." "It isn't, but it is also not partisan. My function is to certify legitimacy, not to declare preference. When the certification issues, it will state simply which claim or claims meet the succession authority's requirements. It will not instruct the Dominion's own institutions on what to do with that finding. That is for Varath governance to determine." She nodded. The motion was angular, a Varath affirmation, and I took it as such. "I'd like," she said, "to understand something about Earth. You have been dormant in our records for 46,000 years. Your world was classified pre-sapient by our surveyors." She paused. "What are you now?" It was not a hostile question. It was a genuine one, and it deserved a genuine answer. "We are what we always were," I said. "We are a species that does not forget and does not waste time. We were classified dormant because your surveyors came before we were ready to be found. We used the time." I glanced briefly toward the windows, where the ring was still crossing overhead in its slow arc, where the Anatolian towers caught the mid-morning light, where 4 continuity-class vessels held their patient station 200 kilometers above us. "We filed the certification registration 30,000 years ago, because it was the correct thing to do with the time we had. We did not know if anyone would ever come to need it. We filed it anyway." Sareth Vell's display was still now, the amber deep and steady. Her aide had put away his verification equipment. The documentation was spread on the table between us. The acknowledgement notation, the charter provisions, the 407-page filing, the records of 30,000 years of institutional continuity. It was not a weapon. It had never been intended as one. It was simply a thing that had been built with great care and made available at the moment it was needed. "We would like to review the documentation in full before the preliminary review period begins," Sareth Vell said. "I'll provide certified copies to both delegations this afternoon," I said. "Is there anything else for this session?" There wasn't. I closed the folder. The 2 delegations rose, at nearly the same moment, which I did not think was accidental, and filed toward their respective doors. At the threshold, Kale Vell paused and turned back. Her display had gone to a slow, quiet gold that I still did not have a precise translation for, but that I was beginning to understand as a kind of deliberate visibility. A display that says, "I am choosing to let you see this." "The archivist," she said, "Peth Cavil, is she still living?" "No," I said. "She died 40 years ago. She never knew the filing would be used." Kale Vell was quiet for a moment. "She filed it anyway." "Yes." "What did she say about it?" "When she submitted it." I had read her final report, the one she had written when the filing was complete, the one that had gone into the deep archive alongside the documentation itself. I had read it many times in 11 years. I knew the relevant passage. She said that the preparation is the answer, that by the time anyone needed the filing, the question of whether it would work would already have been settled by the 30,000 years it had waited. She said that waiting, done correctly, is not passive. It is the longest kind of action. Vell considered this. Then she said, "Your world produces remarkable archivists." "We have had a great deal of time to develop the habit," I said. She left. I stood at the table for a while after both delegations had gone, in the quiet of the treaty chamber, with the morning light moving across the dark stone, and the ring overhead completing its slow arc toward the western horizon. Corvin appeared in the doorway after a few minutes, reading from his slate. "Both delegations are requesting secure channel setup," he said. "Also, the patrol formation has flagged a query from both fleets about framework docking protocols for extended stays. I think they're planning to remain for the review period." "Accommodate them," I said. "Full framework guest protocols, both formations equal treatment." He noted this, then he looked up. "Did it go the way you expected?" I thought about this honestly. "The filing worked the way it was designed to work," I said. "I expected that. The part I didn't fully expect," I paused. "The second daughter asked about Peth Cavill." Corvin waited. "She wanted to know what she had said when she filed it." I looked out the window. The Anatolian city was fully visible in the morning light, all the ordinary life of it going on beneath the towers and the transit lanes and the ring's patient arc. I think she understood what 30,000 years of preparation actually meant, not as a strategic instrument, as a choice that had to be made before anyone knew if it would matter. I picked up the folder. That's the hardest part of the work. Filing the thing when you don't know if you'll live to see it used. Trusting the people who come after you to see it through. Corvin was quiet for a moment. Did Peth Cavill know she wouldn't see it used? "She knew it was statistically probable," I said. "She filed it anyway. 30,000 years is a long time to wait, but it is the correct amount of time, if that is the amount of time that's required." I set the folder down and smoothed the cover with one hand. She wrote in her final report that the filing was not for her generation or the next. It was for the generation that would be sitting at a table some morning with someone who needed to understand that we had been paying attention all along. I looked at the empty chairs, the spread of documentation, the morning light on the dark stone table. "I think she would have found this morning satisfying," I said. The preliminary certification review opened that afternoon. It ran for 27 days. The findings, when they issued, certified both claims as procedurally valid under the Succession Authority's charter, which meant the authority's own conflict resolution mechanism would govern the final determination, with Earth certification forming the foundational record. Both daughters remained at the platform through the review period. They did not become friends. They did not need to. What they became in those 27 days was something I had not anticipated: professionals engaged with a process, rather than rivals competing for a declaration. The difference was subtle. It was also significant. On the 9th day, Vell requested access to the framework's Verath Treaty Archive, the full collection, including the research files from the preparation period. I granted it without hesitation. She spent 3 days in the archive reading room, sometimes with an aide, sometimes alone. I did not observe her directly, but Yara Senth, whose monitoring room adjoined the reading room, told me afterward that the second daughter had spent most of the second day reading the preparation research files. Not the legal documents. The internal correspondence, the memos, the working drafts, the scholarly debates, the record of 11 years of human beings arguing carefully about a provision most of them had never heard of before Peth Cavill found it. On the 13th day, Sareth Vell called me to a brief informal meeting in the outer reception suite. She wanted to understand the framework's institutional structure, how the continuity of the certification body was maintained across administrative transitions, what records were kept of each arbiter's decisions, how the chain of custody for the foundational documents was managed. She asked precise questions and listened to the answers without interrupting. By the end of the meeting, her display was carrying the slow, steady amber of someone who has been building a mental model and has decided it is sound. I thought, watching her leave, that if she became the Dominion's governing authority, she would be thorough about it. That seemed, on balance, to be a good quality in a governing authority. On the last morning, before the certified findings were transmitted to both fleets and the diplomatic record was closed for the preliminary phase, Sareth Vel came to the treaty chamber alone. She was out of formal attire, a traveling cast garment, the Verath equivalent of clothes worn for ordinary work, and her display was the quiet amber of ordinary speech. She asked if she could see the founding document, not the certification filing, the original Tributary Charter 9441V, the record of Earth's classification as a dormant pre-sapient biosphere. I retrieved it from the archive and set it on the table. She read it in silence. The display along her dorsal ridge went very still. "We classified you as dormant," she said, "pre-sapient. We assigned a maintenance review cycle, and then we lost the cycle in the contraction." She looked up. "By the time we returned, you had become a founding observer certifier of the body that governs our succession." "Yes," I said. "You were never dormant." "No." Her display moved in a slow pattern I had been seeing for 27 days and had finally learned to read. The Verath expression for the recognition that one's model of the world was built on a foundation that has turned out to be wrong, and the adjustment to that recognition has been made, and the individual is deciding what to carry forward from it. "What should we have done," she asked, 90,000 years ago, when we classified you?" It was not an angry question. It was a real one. She wanted an honest answer. "Come back," I said. "That's all. We understand the contraction. We understand the administrative collapse of the maintenance schedule. We don't hold it against you as malice. But if you had come back 100,000 years ago, even 50,000 years ago, you would have found us, and we would have begun this conversation then." She looked at the document, "And the filing, if we had come back and found you earlier." "Then the filing would have been used earlier," I said. "Or not filed because the relationship would have been different. I don't know. We prepared for what we had, not for what might have been." I folded my hands. "What we had was 90,000 years, and a set of provisions that most people in your dominion's own legal history had probably never looked at closely enough to see what they contained. We looked. That's what we do." She set the document down carefully. "I'm going to recommend," she said, "when the succession is resolved, that the Dominion review every dormant client classification in our registry." I nodded. "That seems prudent." "I don't know what we'll find." A pause. "I'm not sure we want to know." "You may find nothing," I said. "Or you may find what you found here. Civilizations that spent the dormancy doing what they needed to do, and who are now prepared for conversations you haven't had yet." I stood and extended my hand in the earth manner, which she had learned during the review period, and she took it in the three-fingered Verath formal grip that I had learned in return. "Either way, it is better to know." She left before the morning watch. The formal certification record transmitted at 900. Both fleets acknowledged. By noon, the approach corridor was clear, and the patrol formation had returned to standard spacing. The Anatolian megacity went on below us the way it always did, 12 million people living their ordinary lives beneath the ring's slow arc, unaware that this morning was different from any other morning, except in the way all mornings are different. Something that had been waiting for a long time had finally come due, and the people who had prepared for it had done their work, and the world had turned in the direction it was always turning, steady as the orbit of the thing overhead. I filed the case record that afternoon. It ran to 314 pages, including the preliminary certification findings, the review documentation, and a summary of the treaty chamber proceedings. In the summary I noted, as I note in all my case records, the names of the individuals whose prior work had made the outcome possible. The list for this case was long. It began with Peth Cavell, Junior Archivist, Treaty Division, 40 years gone, who had read a provision that no one had read carefully before and had written a 4-page memo about what it meant. "The filing is the answer," she had written. "By the time anyone reads this in the context it was prepared for, the waiting will already be over. All we are doing in preparing this is making sure that it was done." I read that sentence every year, on the anniversary of the filing date. I read it again that afternoon, after I had closed the case record, while the light was going gold in the Anatolian sky, and the ring overhead was catching the late sun along its western arc. All we are doing in preparing this is making sure that it was done. She had been right. The preparation had been the action. The waiting had been the work. And when the morning came that required it, when the heirs of an empire came down to a world they had left classified as pre-sapient and found instead a senior protocol arbiter with a certified filing 30,000 years old, it had done exactly what it was meant to do. Not loudly, not with weapons or fleets or ultimatums. With 407 pages, a treaty table, and the quiet weight of a civilization that had spent 90,000 years learning the difference between being dormant and being ready. We had never been dormant. We had simply been working.